Hello, this is the Wholesome Reader, and we're back with Father to Nobody's Children, Chapter 4, A Change of Direction. The newspaper accounts of the young medical student's innocent remarks sparked a heated debate in the press. Several letters to the editor expressed shock that conditions such as Bernardo described could be allowed to exist. At the same time, other writers suggested that the stories of homeless children sleeping out in the open air were shocking because they were patently false. Perhaps they argued this medical student was exaggerating. Perhaps he was the victim of an elaborate practical joke played on him by a group of slum children. Perhaps he was an outright liar, hoping to profit by appealing to the sympathy of the public. While this storm of controversy swirled across the pages of the daily papers, the young man, at the center of the fervor, was blissfully ignorant of it all. What with his studies at the hospital, his work with the Ragged Skull, and his private reading of the Bible, Bernardo had no time to pick up a newspaper, and it was only much later that he discovered he had been living in the eye of the hurricane. One man who did read the newspaper and followed the debate with great interest was Earl of Shaftesbury. The Earl was a well-known champion of the poor, especially poor children. His influence had led to the passage of laws that kept children from being forced to work long hours in factories and mines. When he heard the story of children being neglected in London, and of the skeptics who doubted the truth of this claim, he felt he could not rest until he learned the truth. Within a week after the missionary rally, young Bernardo received an invitation to dinner from the Earl. The invitation said that the dinner would be attended by a group of people who were very interested in the condition of homeless children in London. An opportunity to meet others who were interested in the same ministry was very appealing to Bernardo. But he realized also how flattering it was to be invited to dine with such a prominent man. Before he accepted, he prayed that his motives might be pure. When Bernardo arrived that night, he found that the dinner party included over a dozen guests. Bernardo sat next to a prominent physician and struck up a friendship that was to prove lifelong and valuable. Most of the dinner conversation, however, consisted of small talk. It was after dinner that the evening took a different turn. Lord Shaftesbury came up to young Bernardo as the guests were milling around in conversation, and, with the ability of a man accustomed to taking charge of a situation, managed without a word to gain the attention of the entire room. The Earl then began a friendly but detailed interrogation of the medical student. "I have heard," his lordship began, "of your interest in the children of the streets, and I wanted to meet you and learn from your own lips whether the things I am hearing are true. I have heard it said, for instance, that you often find large groups of children asleep at night in various hiding places in different quarters of London, without proper shelter or care. Is that really so?" "Yes," Bernardo replied. "Do you have any trouble getting these children to talk to you?" "No, not once they see that I'm truly interested in them." "And are you ever able to get these children to leave their life on the street?" "Oh, yes." Bernardo was warming to his favorite subject. "I am often able to convince them to come with me at once, and have obtained help for them, but my ability to assist them has been limited by my finances." By this time the group of dinner guests had gathered around the two men, listening to their discussion with great interest. "I suppose, then," Lord Shaftesbury continued, "that you would have no difficulty finding a group of boys sleeping outside tonight?" "Oh, certainly not," Bernardo replied. "Any time after 11:30 or so I could find at least one or two places I know of, quite a number of homeless children sleeping out all night." Lord Shaftesbury looked searchingly at the young man. Bernardo did not know this, but he was in the presence of some of his greatest doubters. The Earl was inclined to have an open mind about Bernardo's story. He himself had seen some quite unbelievable examples of poverty and destitution in the city, but the men gathered in that room generally felt that the medical student was exaggerating, or even making the whole thing up. There was only one way to come to truth in the matter. The Earl issued a challenge. "Could you lead us tonight to one of these sleeping places?" By this time Bernardo probably realized that his honor was at stake, but he rose to the challenge and said, "Yes, I will be glad to guide you to the children as soon as it is late enough." The matter was settled, and little more was said until the hour of midnight. Cabs were called, and the drivers directed to Billingsgate on the East End. Near the fish market in that neighborhood was a wharf where goods were loaded and unloaded from barges on the river. This was Bernardo's destination. A huge pile of goods was stacked there, covered with enormous tarpaulin. The other men saw nothing to indicate where homeless children might be sleeping, but Bernardo knew that they would hide themselves for fear of being captured by the police. Followed by the puzzled group of dinner guests, the young medical student stepped up to the pile, found a space between two tarpaulins to insert his hand, and in a moment drew out a ragged, half-starved boy. The child tumbled to the ground and, rubbing his eyes, began to cry and complain, thinking he had been caught. But Bernardo and the others, who had by now recovered their voices, quickly reassured him they just wanted to help. "Are you the only one in there?" Bernardo asked gently. "No, sir," he replied. "There's a great many more chaps in there." "Well, do you think you could get them out if I gave you a sixpence for your trouble?" "Sixpence? Of course I will, sir. Just a minute and I'll roof 'em." Bernardo was puzzled. "What do you mean you'll roof 'em?" "Let me show you. The whole pile is covered with chaps, and this'll wake 'em up fine." And before the men realized what he was doing, he hopped up on the top of the pile and began stomping his feet. As soon as they learned he was stepping on the bodies of his fellow sleepers, they stopped his little dance, but not before it began to prove effective. The tarpaulin seemed to come alive. Its surface began to bulge and sink like the waves of the sea. One boy after another appeared at the slit between the tarpaulins, and on seeing the group of strange men tried to duck back inside, but the men were too fast for them, and plucked each boy out as soon as he appeared. Unfortunately, this still did not get them all out. The majority were still cowering inside, afraid to show themselves. "Perhaps," the boy Bernardo was holding suggested slyly, "you could offer to give 'em something." Lord Shaftesbury spoke up with authority. "Boys, if you come out, we promise to give you each a penny and something to eat." Suddenly the bottle was uncorked, and a veritable stampede issued forth from the gap between the tarpaulins. The fabric, before so tightly stretched, now began to sag in places, for want of human bodies to hold it up. When all the children had emerged, the men lined them up and began counting. There were 73 boys in all, most with no covering on head or feet. Lord Shaftesbury and his guests were speechless. Even Bernardo was amazed. He had been seeking out the hiding places of homeless children for almost a year, and had never found more than a dozen or so at a time. As he thought back on it in later years, Bernardo recognized God's hand in his finding so large a group of homeless boys. He was in the company of some of the largest philanthropists of London, men who were in a position to help him immensely. All he needed to do was to convince them of the need. And that night, in the East End, he established the truth beyond any doubt. The only question that remained now was where to find food for such a great horde of children. Bernardo suggested a coffee shop he knew of in the neighborhood, Dick Fisher's by name, which was open all night. So off they went, a handful of gentlemen in evening dress and 73 ragged street urchins, a most unlikely crew. Dick Fisher was shocked by the sight of dozens of boys descending on his establishment in the middle of the night, but when he saw the distinguished gentlemen that accompanied them, he did his best to be hospitable. Soon each boy was warming his hands with a steaming mug of coffee and wolfing down slices of buttered bread. Lord Shaftesbury received change from the shop owner and placed the promised penny into every eager little hand. A cheer rose from the children that was deafening. As they surveyed the scene in the coffee shop, the young medical student glanced over at Lord Shaftesbury and was surprised to see tears in the great man's eyes. "All London shall know of this," the Earl whispered to him in a husky, determined voice. Later, as the group broke up to go their separate ways, the Earl spoke warmly to Bernardo and urged him to continue his work with the children. This was only the first of several contacts with Lord Shaftesbury in which the subject of East End orphans came up. Always a man who could recognize gifts and encourage their development, the Earl counseled Bernardo to make the homeless children of London his life's calling. Bernardo himself could see how his abilities and interest seemed to lie in that direction. He found himself eager to finish his studies each day in order to put in his hours seeking out and helping homeless children. Yet he was still undecided. His calling to China as a medical missionary had seemed so clear. "Many of my advisers, among Lord Shaftesbury himself, strongly urged me to give up my whole life to the waif children," he wrote later. "On the other hand, I still felt under the influence of what I believed to be nothing short of a divine call to devote myself to medical missions in China." Beyond his calling was the practical matter of finances. Starting an orphanage would cost money, and where would it come from? All these considerations he weighed over and over in his mind, and his prayers were filled with requests for God's guidance. He was so concerned that he not step out of God's will, that he even prayed that God would stop him, by illness or death if necessary, from making the wrong choice. Finally, the issue was settled as he read the Bible verse, "I will guide thee with mine eye." From then on, he determined to go in the direction that lay before him, and trust that God would show him if he went wrong. A month after the dinner party with Lord Shaftesbury, he applied as a medical missions candidate to China Inland Mission, but was turned down for lack of training. This was the last of his hesitation. He never looked back after that. From then on, he was convinced that he was called to stay in London. Was the call to China just a false impression? Bernardo soon recognized God's hand even in that. "I now saw that the call to medical missions in China had been absolutely necessary," he wrote years later. "Without it, I would never have settled in East London, and probably never would have met my first homeless child." The call to China kept his commitment to the Savior alive, a commitment that had to be total and unswerving for the work that lay ahead of him. For the rest of his life, he always considered the streets of East London his mission field. If he could not go across the sea, he could help others to do so. And it is interesting to note that even though he did not go on the foreign mission field, 17 of his homeless boys did. And that is the end of chapter 4.